When silence begins, it can come from two very different places. One is weakness, the other is power. And the difference is not in the action, but in the frame behind it. No contact can either be a man sitting in pain, waiting, hoping, counting days, and checking his phone, or it can be a man who has chosen himself, who has centered his life, and who has stepped back with self-respect and control. The outside looks the same. The phone is quiet. The messages stop. The distance exists. But the inner state is completely different, and it is the inner state that determines who wins the silent battle. A man who uses no contact as a strategy, but not as a state of being, is still emotionally attached. He is silent, but he is not free. His mind is still orbiting her. His emotions are still tied to the outcome. His identity is still waiting for a response. And that kind of silence has no weight. It is filled with tension, anxiety, and expectation. It is silence that is asking to be broken. On the other hand, a man who enters no contact from a place of self-respect is not waiting. He is not watching. He is not hoping. He is redirecting his energy back to his purpose, his discipline, his growth, his life. His silence is not empty. It is full of movement, direction, and internal stability. And that difference is felt even without words. When silence comes from need, it carries emotional noise. It carries a subtle pressure. It carries the vibration of, I hope she reaches out. And the human nervous system is extremely sensitive to that. People feel when someone is emotionally leaning, even at a distance. But when silence comes from strength, it carries calm. It carries certainty. It carries the unspoken message, I am at peace whether you return or not. And that is heavy. That is rare. That is magnetic. No contact from weakness is passive. It is a pause filled with longing. No contact from power is active. It is a step forward into your own life. One is about trying to create an effect in her. The other is about creating alignment in yourself. This is why two men can do the same thing, yet get completely different results. Both stop texting. Both disappear. But one is emotionally stuck, and the other is emotionally free. One is hoping to be chosen again. The other is choosing himself. And in the silent battle, the one who chooses himself always wins. Because silence is not about absence. It is about presence. Presence in your own body. Presence in your own direction, presence in your own standards. A man who is fully present in his own life does not feel the urge to reach out for validation. He does not feel the need to prove anything. He does not feel the anxiety of being forgotten. He is grounded, and grounding changes everything. Silence from power also means you are no longer negotiating your worth. You are no longer trying to explain your value. You are no longer chasing closure. You are letting your absence speak for you. An absence, when it comes from a man who is stable and self-respecting, carries far more weight than words ever could. This kind of silence is not reactive, it is deliberate. It is the silence of a man who knows that his energy is valuable and that he will not pour it into a space that no longer honors it. And here is the truth most people miss. No contact is not about making her miss you. It is about making yourself whole again. It is about removing your emotional dependence on an outcome. It is about reclaiming your center. When you are centered, your silence is not a tactic. It is a byproduct of your focus. You are too engaged in your own growth, your own mission, your own life to be orbiting someone who chose distance. And that is when silence becomes powerful. Because the one who is truly at peace in no contact is the one who is no longer fighting an internal war. He is not trying to win her back. He is winning himself back. And in any silent battle, the man who is not waiting is the man who has already won. Even when there are no words, no messages, no visible interaction, your emotional state is still being felt. Silence is never neutral. It carries energy, and that energy is shaped by what is happening inside you. This is why no contact can either create curiosity and respect, or it can quietly weaken your position without you realizing it. If your silence is filled with anxiety, with overthinking, with checking your phone, with wondering what she is doing, with hoping she reaches out, that emotional state leaks. It leaks through your social presence, your timing, your reactions, even through the subtle shifts in your behavior when contact eventually happens. And on a subconscious level, she can feel it. Not logically, but emotionally. The nervous system reads emotional states long before the mind forms conclusions. Anxious silence feels tight. It feels heavy with expectation. It feels like a held breath, and held breath carries tension. Tension that says, I am waiting, I am hoping, I am not settled within myself. That kind of silence does not create psychological weight. It creates emotional transparency. It reveals attachment. It reveals that the outcome still controls you. But calm silence is different. Calm silence feels grounded. It feels complete. It feels like a man who has exhaled and returned to himself. There is no emotional leaning, no internal pulling, no subtle pressure, just stillness and direction. And that stillness is powerful, because when your silence is calm, it communicates that your emotional center is stable, that your life is moving, that your identity is not paused, that your sense of self is not suspended in uncertainty. You are not waiting for a message to decide how you feel about yourself. You already feel whole. This is what creates psychological weight. Not the absence of words, but the presence of inner stability. A woman is highly sensitive to emotional congruence. She feels when a man's outer behavior does not match his inner state. A man can say nothing, but if inside he is restless, needy, or outcome dependent, that emotional frequency is felt. It comes through later in his tone, in his timing, in his reactions, in the subtle urgency behind his words when contact resumes. But when your silence comes from detachment, from self-focus, from emotional completion, it carries a different signal. I am not shaken. I am not waiting. I am not trying to control the outcome. That signal creates curiosity. It creates respect. It creates the sense that you are no longer emotionally available in the same way. And that shift is deeply felt. Silence backed by anxiety says, I am trying not to text. Silence backed by strength says, I have no need to text. One is effort. The other is state of being. The nervous system of another person can feel the difference. One feels tight and emotionally reaching. The other feels settled and self-contained. And self-contained energy is attractive because it signals self-sufficiency. When you are emotionally settled, your silence has no agenda. You are not using it to get a reaction. You are not using it to create fear of loss. You are simply living your life. And that lack of agenda removes pressure from the interaction. Pressure is what makes people pull away. Calm is what makes them become curious. This is why two people can both be in no contact, but only one creates impact. The one whose silence is rooted in peace creates space in the other person's mind. The one whose silence is rooted in longing creates relief instead of curiosity. Calm silence also shifts the power dynamic, because the moment you are no longer emotionally dependent on an outcome, you stop broadcasting need. And when need disappears, value becomes clearer. You are no longer trying to hold on. You are simply standing in yourself. That standing creates a subtle emotional contrast. It makes your absence feel different. Not dramatic, not painful, but noticeable, grounded heavy in a quiet way. And this is what the silent battle is really about. Not who texts first, not who waits longer, but whose inner world is stable and whose is still revolving around the outcome. The person who is emotionally free during no contact carries the calm of someone who has already accepted every possibility. That acceptance dissolves fear. And when fear is gone, strength becomes visible. Silence backed by fear feels fragile. Silence backed by acceptance feels unshakable. And the one who is unshakable even without speaking is the one who controls the emotional frame. Because energy always speaks before words ever do. In any silent battle, the real victory is not measured by who reaches out first, who breaks, or who sends the message. The real victory is internal. It belongs to the one who has already moved on emotionally. Because the moment you no longer need contact, you have already won. Most people think power lies in restraint, in forcing themselves not to text, in counting days and proving discipline. But restraint is still a form of attachment. It means your emotions are still locked in a struggle. You are still investing energy in holding back. You are still reacting to the situation. And reaction, even in silence, means the situation still controls you. Emotional independence is different. It is not silence with effort. It is silence with ease. It is the state where your nervous system has accepted reality, where your mind is no longer looping, where your sense of self is no longer waiting for resolution from another person. This is why the one who moves on internally always wins the silent battle, because they are no longer in the battle. When you no longer need a message to feel validated, when you no longer replay conversations in your head, when you no longer wonder what she is thinking or who she is with, your emotional center returns to you. And the moment your center is back in your own hands, the dynamic shifts completely. You stop measuring time, you stop watching, you stop hoping, you stop interpreting silence as meaning something about your worth. Your life begins to move forward again. Your energy goes back into your body, your goals, your discipline, your future. You are no longer psychologically stuck in a moment that has already passed. And this is the true form of power, emotional self-sufficiency, because the person who still needs contact is still negotiating, negotiating with hope, negotiating with memory, negotiating with the possibility of being chosen again. Even if they say nothing, their inner world is still leaning outward, but the one who has emotionally let go is no longer leaning. They are standing. Standing means your identity is no longer tied to how this story ends. It means your peace is no longer dependent on whether someone returns. It means your sense of value is no longer up for external confirmation. And when a man reaches that state, something subtle but profound happens. His energy changes, his posture changes, his timing changes, his reactions change. He becomes slower, calmer, more grounded, not because he is trying to appear strong, but because he is strong internally. This is why the silent battle is never about who texts first. It is about who is free first. Freedom is not indifference. Freedom is acceptance. It is the quiet knowing that whatever happens next, you are solid. You will not collapse. You will not chase. You will not lose yourself. You will continue forward. And that state of inner freedom carries a kind of psychological gravity, because it signals that you are no longer emotionally available in the same way. Not closed, not bitter, but complete. Completion is powerful because it removes the need to prove, persuade, or pursue. It removes the subtle tension that says, I need this to work. And when that tension is gone, your presence, even in absence, becomes heavier. The one who has moved on emotionally does not seek to win. He does not need to be right. He does not need to be missed. He does not need an apology. He does not need an explanation. His nervous system is no longer in a state of unresolved attachment. And unresolved attachment is what keeps people psychologically hooked. The moment attachment dissolves, the dynamic ends. Not dramatically, not with closure speeches, but quietly with inner detachment. This is why emotional independence always shifts the balance, because the one who is no longer emotionally invested is no longer controllable by hope, fear, or memory. They are no longer reactive. They are no longer trying to restore a past version of themselves or the relationship. They are present, and presence is grounding. In the silent battle, the person who is still waiting is still fighting. The person who has accepted and moved on has already laid down their weapon. And the one who lays down the weapon from a place of strength, not defeat, is the one who has truly won. Because the ultimate power is not in being contacted. It is in no longer needing to be. When words disappear, the mind begins to fill the space. This is where silence becomes more powerful than any explanation ever could be. Because explanations try to convince the logical mind, but absence speaks directly to the emotional one. And emotion is what creates reflection, comparison, and realization. When you are present, your value is often taken for granted. Your attention, your effort, your consistency become part of the environment. Familiar, predictable, safe. And what is familiar is rarely fully appreciated. The human mind does not measure what it has, it measures what it loses. This is why no contact reveals value in a way that arguments, emotional talks, or long messages never can. Words can be ignored, feelings can be debated, but absence cannot be argued with. It is felt. When you are no longer there to provide comfort, reassurance, validation, or emotional stability, the nervous system of the other person notices the shift. The space you once filled becomes empty, and the mind begins to scan that emptiness, asking questions it never asked when you were present. Where did that energy go? Why does it feel quieter now? Why does something feel missing? Silence removes distraction. There is no new input from you, no new emotional stimulation, no new reassurance. The brain, designed to seek patterns and meaning, turns inward. It replays moments. It revisits memories. It compares the past emotional state with the present emotional state. And in that comparison, value becomes clear. Not because you explained it, not because you defended yourself, but because the contrast made it undeniable. The warmth that once existed is no longer there. The stability that once grounded her emotions is gone. The attention that once made her feel seen and chosen has vanished. This is how absence creates emotional clarity. Words can be rationalized away. She can tell herself stories about why things happened, who was right, who was wrong. But the emotional body still registers the loss, and the emotional body does not respond to logic, it responds to feeling. When your presence is removed, the emotional system begins to search for it, not desperately at first, but curiously. And curiosity leads to reflection. Reflection leads to comparison. Comparison leads to realization. Realization that something of value is no longer available. This is why trying to convince someone of your worth is always weaker than letting your absence reveal it. Convincing is an attempt to control perception. Absence allows perception to form naturally without resistance. And what forms naturally carries more weight. Silence also removes the ability to emotionally regulate through you. When you were present, your words, your attention, your reassurance may have helped her stabilize her emotions. Without you, that regulation is gone. She must now sit with her own feelings. The comfort of your presence is no longer there to soften them. This forces an internal reckoning, not in a dramatic movie-like way, but in a quiet psychological way, in moments of stillness, in moments when the mind wanders, in moments when something reminds her of you, in moments when she notices the difference between then and now, and that difference is what creates weight. Absence also prevents you from lowering your value through over-explaining. The more you talk, the more you risk justifying, chasing, or emotionally negotiating. The more you negotiate, the more your value becomes something to be debated instead of felt. Silence removes the debate. It removes the negotiation. It leaves only the reality of loss and contrast. This is why no contact, when done from strength and emotional independence, becomes so powerful. Not because it manipulates, but because it allows the natural psychological process of realization to unfold. And realization is always more impactful than persuasion. When you step back without bitterness, without drama, without emotional collapse, your absence becomes clean. It is not polluted by need or anger. It is simply a quiet withdrawal of energy. And clean absence is heavy. It does not provoke defensiveness. It invites reflection. Reflection leads to understanding. Understanding leads to comparison. Comparison leads to recognition. Recognition of what your presence actually meant. Not because you said it, but because it is no longer there. And when value is felt through absence rather than argued through words, it settles deeper in the emotional mind. It becomes something experienced, not just thought about. That is when silence truly speaks. When you walk away without anger, without insults, without emotional chaos, you communicate something far more powerful than any argument ever could. You communicate boundaries. And boundaries are the language of self-respect. They silently say, "This is how I allow myself to be treated, and this is where I stop." Most people think boundaries are created through long conversations, through explanations, through demands for change. But the strongest boundaries are created through action, through the decision to remove yourself from situations where your value is not matched, where your effort is not respected, where your presence is taken lightly. Silence, when it comes from self-respect, becomes a boundary in its purest form. Because you are no longer trying to convince someone to treat you better. You are no longer negotiating your worth. You are no longer asking for understanding. You are simply withdrawing access. And access is what gives people the chance to either appreciate or misuse your energy. When you stay and over-explain, when you argue, when you seek validation for your feelings, you are still offering access. You are still emotionally available. You are still giving your presence while asking for different behavior. That creates mixed signals. It says, "This hurts me, but I will remain." And the nervous system of the other person learns that your boundaries are flexible. But when you leave quietly, without hostility and without pleading, you teach a different lesson. You teach that your presence is conditional on respect, that your energy is not unlimited, that indifference or inconsistency has consequences, even if those consequences are not dramatic or loud. This is where regret begins to form, not immediately, not in a burst of emotion, but gradually as the reality of your absence settles in, as the comfort of your availability is no longer there. As the emotional safety you provided is no longer accessible, the mind begins to connect dots, the heart begins to feel the gap, and the nervous system begins to register that something stable has been removed. And in that realization, a subtle question forms. Why did he leave? Not in a blaming way, in a reflective way. And the answer, whether consciously or unconsciously, points back to boundaries, to moments of indifference, to moments of taking your presence for granted, to moments where your effort was not matched. Silence forces this reflection because there is no argument to distract from it. There is no ongoing emotional exchange to blur responsibility. There is only the result: you are no longer there. That absence becomes a mirror that reflects behavior, choices, and the cost of them. This is how boundaries teach, not through punishment, but through consequence. Not through anger, but through withdrawal, not through control, but through self-respect. When a man walks away calmly, he communicates that he values his inner stability more than the comfort of staying in a dynamic that does not honor him, that he would rather be alone in peace than connected in disrespect, that he does not need to beg for consideration. And that standard, once felt, is not easily forgotten, because most people are not used to someone leaving without drama. They are used to arguments. They are used to emotional outbursts. They are used to negotiations and second chances. But quiet self-respect is different. It carries a finality that is not harsh but firm. It says, I know what I deserve, and I will not chase what does not meet me there. That is what creates regret. Not the desire to hurt, but the realization that access was lost because it was not valued. And when access is gone, the mind begins to replay interactions, to notice moments where effort was taken for granted, to recognize where consistency was met with inconsistency, to feel the absence of the emotional stability that was once freely given. This is how silence teaches the cost of indifference. This is how boundaries become felt rather than argued. This is how self-respect becomes visible without a single word. And in that quiet realization, the standard you set remains. When you walk away without anger, without insults, without emotional chaos, you communicate something far more powerful than any argument ever could. You communicate boundaries. And boundaries are the language of self-respect. They silently say, this is how I allow myself to be treated, and this is where I stop. Most people think boundaries are created through long conversations, through explanations, through demands for change. But the strongest boundaries are created through action, through the decision to remove yourself from situations where your value is not matched, where your effort is not respected, where your presence is taken lightly. Silence, when it comes from self-respect, becomes a boundary in its purest form, because you are no longer trying to convince someone to treat you better. You are no longer negotiating your worth. You are no longer asking for understanding. You are simply withdrawing access. And access is what gives people the chance to either appreciate or misuse your energy. When you stay and over-explain, when you argue, when you seek validation for your feelings, you are still offering access. You are still emotionally available. You are still giving your presence while asking for different behavior. That creates mixed signals. It says, this hurts me, but I will remain. And the nervous system of the other person learns that your boundaries are flexible. But when you leave quietly, without hostility and without pleading, you teach a different lesson. You teach that your presence is conditional on respect, that your energy is not unlimited, that indifference or inconsistency has consequences, even if those consequences are not dramatic or loud. This is where regret begins to form, not immediately, not in a burst of emotion, but gradually as the reality of your absence settles in, as the comfort of your availability is no longer there, as the emotional safety you provided is no longer accessible. The mind begins to connect dots, the heart begins to feel the gap, and the nervous system begins to register that something stable has been removed. And in that realization, a subtle question forms, why did he leave? Not in a blaming way, in a reflective way. And the answer, whether consciously or unconsciously, points back to boundaries, to moments of indifference, to moments of taking your presence for granted, to moments where your effort was not matched. Silence forces this reflection because there is no argument to distract from it. There is no ongoing emotional exchange to blur responsibility. There is only the result: you are no longer there. That absence becomes a mirror that reflects behavior, choices, and the cost of them. This is how boundaries teach, not through punishment, but through consequence. Not through anger, but through withdrawal. Not through control, but through self-respect. When a man walks away calmly, he communicates that he values his inner stability more than the comfort of staying in a dynamic that does not honor him, that he would rather be alone in peace than connected in disrespect, that he does not need to beg for consideration. And that standard, once felt, is not easily forgotten because most people are not used to someone leaving without drama. They are used to arguments. They are used to emotional outbursts. They are used to negotiations and second chances. But quiet self-respect is different. It carries a finality that is not harsh but firm. It says, I know what I deserve, and I will not chase what does not meet me there. That is what creates regret. Not the desire to hurt, but the realization that access was lost because it was not valued. And when access is gone, the mind begins to replay interactions, to notice moments where effort was taken for granted, to recognize where consistency was met with inconsistency, to feel the absence of the emotional stability that was once freely given. This is how silence teaches the cost of indifference. This is how boundaries become felt rather than argued. This is how self-respect becomes visible without a single word. And in that quiet realization, the standard you set remains. When you leave without collapsing, without chasing, without trying to rewrite the past, you undergo a subtle but powerful transformation in the other person's mind. You are no longer just a memory. You become a standard, a reference point, a measure against which future experiences are compared. Most people fade into nostalgia. They are remembered as moments, as feelings, as chapters that closed. But a man who exits with self-respect and emotional control leaves something different behind. He leaves an imprint, an emotional benchmark, not because he demanded to be remembered, but because his absence carried weight. Silence, when it is grounded and dignified, does not erase you. It crystallizes you. Your calm withdrawal signals that you were not operating from desperation, that your presence was not dependent on being chosen, that your value was internal, not granted. And that kind of exit reframes how you are stored in memory. You are not filed under loss. You are filed under what could have been if. This is where the mind begins to compare, not obsessively, not dramatically, but quietly. When she meets other men, when she experiences different emotional energies, different levels of stability, different standards, your absence becomes a contrast. The nervous system remembers how it felt to be with someone who was grounded, consistent, emotionally contained. And in that comparison, you become the reference. Not because you were perfect, but because your emotional posture at the end was strong. You did not plead. You did not beg. You did not unravel. You did not lower yourself to be chosen. You chose dignity, and dignity is rare. What is rare is remembered. A man who leaves in chaos becomes a lesson in what went wrong. A man who leaves in control becomes a symbol of what was lost. And symbols carry more psychological weight than stories. Because stories can be rewritten, symbols stay fixed. Your silence, your boundaries, your emotional independence form that symbol. They communicate without words. I am not replaceable in the way you think. Not because of ego, but because of the way I carry myself. This does not come from trying to be unforgettable. It comes from being unshakable. Unshakable energy lingers. It does not haunt, but it stays present in the background of memory, as a quiet standard of how stability, self-respect, and emotional maturity once felt. This is why becoming a standard is different from being missed. Being missed is emotional and temporary. It rises and falls with loneliness, with nostalgia, with mood. Being a standard is deeper. It lives in comparison, in contrast, in the subconscious measuring of experiences. When she encounters emotional inconsistency, she will remember your steadiness. When she encounters insecurity, she will remember your calm. When she encounters emotional chaos, she will remember your control, not as longing, as recognition. Recognition that something solid once existed. And this is not about ego or wanting to be irreplaceable. It is about understanding the psychological impact of self-respect. The way a man handles endings defines how he is remembered. The way he holds his frame in silence defines how much weight his presence had. When you do not chase, you do not shrink in memory. You expand, because you are no longer associated with need, but with strength. You are no longer associated with loss, but with a standard that was not met again. This is what it means to win the silent battle, not to get the last word, not to be the one who is contacted, but to become the one whose emotional posture is quietly compared to others. And that only happens when you exit clean. No bitterness, no manipulation, no emotional collapse, just calm withdrawal and forward movement. Forward movement is what seals the imprint, because it tells the subconscious mind that you did not break, that you did not pause your life, that you did not revolve around the past. You continued, you grew, you stabilized, and stability is what creates a standard, not dominance, not control, not drama, but emotional self-sufficiency. In the end, the man who leaves with dignity does not become a memory that fades. He becomes a reference point that remains. And that is the quiet power of winning without saying a word.